Out here, the West ain't just dust and gun smoke, it's blood, betrayal, and legends carved in iron. These are the forgotten tales of outlaws, lawmen, and drifters chasing gold, vengeance, and redemption. Welcome to Dust and Iron Tales. The glass canyon stretched before them, a cathedral of reflected light that turned the sun to shards. Doctor. Evelyn Reed kept close, her gear rattling softly, as the hollow valley breathed with a strange musical resonance. The shadows stretched long and thin across walls that seemed to breathe, pulsing with every step they took. Near the eye, the fractures multiplied into a lattice that refracted sound into 1,000 deceptive doors. Evelyn's tuning fork sang in her grip, and the canyon answered with a chorus that felt almost tactile against their teeth and bones. Thorn moved like a man who had learned to count seconds by the cadence of echoes, never trusting a single note. A voice, clear as cold water, rose from a distant echo of Peterson, or the canyon wearing Peterson's face as a whisper. The ground beneath them trembled with a shallow tremor, as if the canyon itself hovered between a sigh and a scream. The humming swelled into a halo of light that glimmered along every facet, throwing them into a dozen parallel realities at once. The first illusion peeled away, revealing a man who wasn't there, his hand outstretched as if to catch their last breath. Thorn slapped his belt, every instinct telling him to backtrack, but the ice pool was the tide in a dry riverbed. Evelyn calibrated her instruments, noting their frequencies spiked with a glass thinned, suggesting a natural resonant chamber. A chorus of distant voices rippled through the walls, singing in a dialect torn from old mining songs and old regrets. The canyon's song dampened their courage with a precise, almost mathematical cadence that pressed on nerve and memory. They realized the singers were not spirits but echoes, sound images projected by the canyon's crystalline lattice. To reach the source, they navigated a corridor where every step reshaped the reflections, as if the walls remembered their footprints. Beyond a slanted arch, they found a chamber where a natural prism stood, following and amplifying the canyon's own harmonics. There, perched in the air like a held note, floated the silhouette of a prospector calling for help, tethered to a doomed memory. One steadied Evelyn with a glance, understanding that the only way out was to reverse the projection by overpowering it with a cleaner, pure tone from her tuning fork. When Evelyn struck the fork in a single, perfect note, the chamber trembled and the echoes collapsed into silence, and they escaped the glass canyon with a heartbeat lighted, and a story that would outlive the shimmer of its walls. They moved through the earliest light as if stepping from a dream into a new map, the canyon's echoing grip loosened behind them, a prosaic memory slipping from their shoulders. He, whose voice had collapsed into silence, walked with a new kind of measured pace, as if conserving sound for the stories he would tell. They found a river where the rocks wore vines like green scales and the water whispered in a language only travelers remember. On the far bank, a withered sign spoke of ruts and rain, and they followed it with a nod that felt almost ceremonial. The shimmer on the canyon walls faded behind them, leaving only a memory that shivered when touched. They spoke rarely, letting the landscape answer in color and scent and the thump of distant drums in the air. When night pressed in, the moon rose pale and unwitnessed, and the story began to unspool at their feet. He found a cadence again, one that matched the heartbeat they carried from the canyon, a drumbeat stubborn and true. Each step stitched new meaning into the tale, until the line between their own lives and the story blurred. The city that awaited was not a place but a possibility, a doorway opening where the old maps fray at the edges. They learned to listen to the city air's quiet, to the soft clatter of trains that seemed to remember every departure. In the margins of a bakery window, the scent of cinnamon tangled with the memory of glass, a reminder that sweetness survives storms. They traded rumors for rations and kept the weight of their secret carefully balanced in their palms. The narrative they carried began to glow faintly in the corners of rooms, as if the walls themselves leaned closer to hear. People asked where they had been, and they answered with half-truths that still carried the truth their sound. The story grew wings, fluttering inside their chests and guiding their hands toward doors that were not yet open. They found a child who asked to hear the part about the heartbeat, and they told it softly so the child could sleep with courage. By the time they reached the last train platform before morning, the canyon's memory had become their compass, and when they finally stepped into the bright ordinary morning, they carried the shimmer within them as a quiet ember, ready to outlive the walls by simply continuing to tell what happened. They woke to a house that hummed with the quiet of routine and a memory that refused to shrink in the daylight. The shimmer inside them flickered like a hell breath, not quite a flame, but something that could still be told. On the kitchen table, steam rose from the kettle and they cupped it with quiet hands, listening. The walls had learned to listen too, savoring the stories that passed through the rooms, as if the floorboards were syllables. They spoke softly about what happened, not to relive it aloud, but to keep it from evaporating into the ordinary. In the pantry, Giles remembered winters when scarcity taught them to share what mattered most. Outside, a sparrow paused on the sill as if waiting for a punctuation mark. The ember in their chest asked them to tell it again, in a way the walls could not forget. So they moved through the day with a patient cadence, tracing the events like a map that refuses to fold. Every small act breathing, listening. Serving tea became a line in the ongoing report. The shimmer refused to go stale, brightening the margins whenever routine pressed in too close. They learned to tell as if the future depended on the accuracy of memory, and the present on courage. Neighbors passed and asked for news, and they answered with fragments that hinted at what mattered. The children, now older, asked for bedtime stories in their own voices, gentler but no less true. Even the calendar seemed to bend, leaving space between dates where possibility could rest. When evening came, they gathered by the window and let the night absorb what had happened. The shimmer settled into a soft glow that did not demand attention, but invited it. They understood that telling was not about repetition, but about keeping the room honest. So they kept moving through the ordinary, letting the shimmer travel like a breath between breaths. And somewhere beyond the walls, the story widened, ready to outlive the day by simply continuing to tell what happened. The dawn stirred the pages like a careful hand turning a well-loved book. Each sentence woke a new street, a new memory, a new breath of wind that smelled of rain and old copper. People passing by the walls forgot their own names for a moment and listened to the soft murmur of ink being laid down. The narrator, a quiet companion, walked at the edge of the line and whispered favors to the unseen. In the plaza, lanterns learned to glow in memory, not just in light, and the shadows learned to stand still. A child pressed a hand against the wooden gate and found a hinge that hummed like a distant violin. On the far side, a river of stories coursed beneath the city, teaching patience to the stones. The rain began as a suggestion and then became a chorus, tapping rhythms on rooftops that sounded like old drums. People gathered not to see an ending, but to witness a continuation that refused to tire. The walls, listening, gathered thin white leaves of snow that spelled out names no one would forget. Somewhere a door opened inward and revealed another door, and behind it, a room full of echoes asking for a new answer. The singer in the market lifted a corner of the tune and let it float over the crowd like a kite. A dog trailed after a shadow and found a pocket of air where time slowed to a gentle inhale. The day kept feeding itself with little miracles, an umbrella unfurling in the wind, a coin that refused to land heads or tails. Conversations braided themselves into staircases that would not collapse underfoot but windingly invite you upward. In the distance, a lighthouse blinked in Morse, not for ships but for stories seeking a harbour. People remembered how the first line began, and because of that memory, the second line stretched on with a longer breath. The city took a long, satisfied pause, as if listening to its own heartbeat, then chose to keep beating. Somewhere behind the walls the cathedrals of rumour rung with the soft chime of possibility, endlessly tuning to the next moment. And so the narrative kept its promise, widening again, a gentle tide that wrote the day into forever by telling what happened. The street emptied of rush, leaving only the soft rhythm of rain tapping the pavement. Then the old storyteller lifted his hat, and the room leaned in like a shoreline listening to the sea. He spoke of a morning when the city woke with the scent of bread and rain-washed bricks. People in the front row felt the morning light warm their knuckles, as if memory itself were training gold. A boy named Leo found a coin on the curb and tucked it in his pocket as if it were a small star. The coin hummed faintly, a rumour of ships and far harbours, and Leo knew it belonged to something larger. The rain began again in fragile drops, and every drop sounded like a sentence finishing itself. The grandmother in the back sang softly to the rain, and her voice braided the scene together. The narrative, like tide water, rose and receded, leading shells of detail on the shore of memory. A dog barked once, twice, and the echo carried through the room as if the city itself were listening. The storyteller told of two strangers who met under a shop awning and chose to walk together till night fell. They learned each other's names in a language that felt older than sleep. When they spoke of fear, the words grew wings and learned how to fly away. The clock on the wall kept good time with their breath, ticking softly in the background. Outside, a street sweeper nodded to passerby, and the world offered a small, ordinary mercy. The narrative braided their choices with a weather, so that even a rain cloud seemed to have a purpose. Someone laughed a line that wasn't even funny, and the room shrugged with shared recognition. In the pause after the laughter, The storyteller poured us a sip of quiet that tasted like tea cake and thunder. When the tide pulled back, the room carried a memory brighter than daylight, as if dawn had learned to smile at us again. And so we closed the page a little softer, ready to wake tomorrow to the same tide teaching us what happened. The winter breathed salt and light as dawn gathered its pale coins along the sill. We didn't speak at first, only listened to the slow sigh of the harbour. The bedsheets kept the memory of the night under their folds, like small boats tucked away. Outside, the tide idled in, then decided to advance, a patient argument against the shore. The gull, braver than the rest, skimmed the glass of the seawall and cried as if reciting a spell. In the kitchen, the kettle chose to whistle softly, as if approving the next chapter. We drew our chairs to the table where the map lay, its ink still damp from last night's weather-studied talk. On the map, the coastline curved like a question mark, inviting an answer we were not ready to give. The paper edge bore a smear of rain that had seeped inward and become something almost legible. We spoke in words that felt weathered yet true, naming the things the tide had tried to teach us. Some of our lessons were easy, like patience, others more stubborn, like salt clinging to a wound. The loom of the morning carried a thread of bravery we hadn't counted on. We folded the night into a pocket of memory and rose to meet the rising hour. The harbour woke with a sigh, and fishermen scrubbed their nets as if dusting off a dream. I thought of the page we closed and wondered what other chapters would arrive wearing the foam of the sea. If we followed the tide, maybe we would learn what we could not say aloud last night. A soft breeze turned the page of a newspaper someone had left on the pier, revealing an ordinary hopeful headline. We stepped into the doorway and let the horizon pull us toward whatever would come next. The town woke with the smell of coffee and cold sand, and the quiet promise of another day's weather. And so we walked, not toward certainty, but toward the gentle rhythm that keeps us honest with ourselves. The air felt cooler than yesterday, and the street lamps flickered with a careful mercy. We spoke little, letting the steps file the gaps between us into a soft rhythm. Every storefront sighed with its own memory, as if listening for a familiar footfall. The dog barked once and then drifted back into the hush between houses. I thought about the choice we had made not to pretend certainty could be bought. The road curved toward a creek where water stitched silver threads through stones. We paused at the bridge and watched the current bar our silhouettes and stretched them out. He told me you were learning to name things as they are, not as you hoped they would be. I said that honesty often tastes like cold tea left in a thermos too long. We laughed softly, and the sound settled into the air like a new mint leaf on a tongue. The town seemed to exhale with us, doors shifting in their frames as if we had given it a nod. A distant train hummed, not to announce arrival, but to remind us that movement is itself a form of faith. We crossed a narrow alley where ivy clung to brick-like stubborn memory. In the glow of a street light, your face looked both older and younger at once. A map of the miles we had walked. I realized the itinerary we had chosen was less about distance and more about listening to the spaces between words. A sign swung gently in the wind, and for a moment it spelled out a proverb we didn't need to translate. The night wore a velvet hush, thick enough to catch dreams if one leaned close enough. We kept on, not chasing an end point, but tracing the lines that stitched tomorrow to today. When we finally came to a bench overlooking the river, we sat and let the world exhale around us. And in that stillness, we found a small compass inside us, not pointing to answers, but toward the next honest step. We carried that quiet instrument through the town's sleeping streets. The needle trembled at every doorway, as if it could sense the air turning with each decision. At dawn, the compass hummed softly, guiding us toward the river where the willows kept their own counsel. We learned that its riddle wasn't about grand destinations, but about showing up for the next honest action. Sometimes that action meant saying nothing when words would only loosen trust. Sometimes it meant returning what we had borrowed from someone else's courage. We began to map a small itinerary of honest steps, listen more, envy less, admit mistakes, forgive promptly. The compass refused to hurry, and so did we, letting time expand in between traces. On the hillside, a stray dog followed us, tail low, and we offered it the bread in our pockets. The dog blinked as if approving our decision to slow down. Even the wind seemed to keep its own counsel, not rushing toward endings but toward beginnings that stayed. We learned to measure our courage by how small a step we could take without breaking someone else's heart. Sometimes the next step is simply to apologize to ourselves for pretending to have it all figured out. Other times it meant staying by the fire with a friend who had forgotten how to dream aloud. The compass never spoke in proclamations, only in soft nudges that felt like remembering. When we reached the old bridge, we paused, not to cross, but to listen to the water recounting its own mistakes and blessings. We realized the river didn't erase the past. It framed it for the next honest step. We stepped onto the planks, and each step echoed with a new responsibility toward the truth we were building together. The compass shivered, then settled into a gentle stillness, as if it had chosen us as its own guardians. So we walked on, following not a map of certainty, but a quiet promise to keep choosing the next honest step again and again. The evening pressed in softly, a velvet hush that listened for footfalls rather than answers. Samara River whispered about forgiveness, about leaving footprints of the morning to translate. We learned to measure time by the weight of stones in our pockets rather than by clocks. The road grew gentler, as if it noticed our stubborn tenderness for truth and offered us an easier pace. A fox watched from the edge of scrub, tilting its head as if to ask which horizon we intended to name next. We spoke in tiny promises, the kind that could be kept if we kept choosing to keep them. The stars rearranged themselves into patient letters, spelling out small codes in the dark. There were detours, yes, but each detour carried a lesson that needed telling to the next deer we encountered. My hand found yours and held on, not because I knew the way, but because you did not let go first. At dawn the air smelled of wet earth and possible beginnings. The mountains listened as if every breath we took was a note in a quiet chorus. We learned to tolerate the long pauses between steps, since silence had its own kind of honesty. A sparrow stitched its song into the breeze, and we covered the thread with our own lungs. The path curled, then straightened, and we followed with the steady gravity of hope rather than certainty. Sometimes a choice felt small, almost shy, but it carried the weight of every choice that came after it. We tasted the bitterness of fear and let it fall away when we placed one foot in front of the other. A memory surfaced, not to anchor us, but to remind us we were not alone in the making of these steps. In the notebooks we carried, we sketched only what the heart could bear to admit in ink and light. Night gathered us like a blanket and whispered that the map could wait, that the truth would keep us moving. So we kept moving, not toward a destination, but toward the kind of honesty that doesn't quit when the road grows quiet. The wind kept a cautious rhythm, like a companion who knows when to speak and when to listen. We spoke in fragments, letting awkward truths drift up instead of forcing a neat conclusion. There were days when the map blurred and the compass needle trembled, but we kept walking anyway. At every crossroad, we chose the version of ourselves that could admit failure without apology. The road rose and fell like a sentence with a few too many clauses, and we learned to endure the pauses. We learned to listen for the small sounds that honesty makes when it's not sure it belongs. A distant engine hummed, and we treated it as a reminder that momentum can be gentle. The moon slid between clouds, and we named the night not a barrier but a mirror. We traded stories we could barely bear to tell, then pressed on with them stitched into the seam of the journey. Sometimes the honesty came in silence, and we accepted it as a soft rain on a stubborn landscape. There were nights when sleep refused to come, and honesty kept watch on the door like a stubborn friend. We learned that quiet is not emptiness, but a space where intention can breathe a little. There were hesitations, yes, but we folded them into action rather than letting them rot into resentment. The road wore our footprints like a ledger, summing up what we dared to admit and what we refused to explain away. We found honesty not in bold revolutions, but in small, stubborn choices that survived the morning light. Sometimes the horizon looked back with a tired smile as if to say, "Keep going, you eat closer than you think." We learned to celebrate the minimal victories, a loaded sigh released, a truce spoken without garnish. The landscape changed its clothes, and we changed ours too. Nothing flashy, just more honest about what we could endure. When trouble arrived, we didn't pretend not to see it. We met it with a steady pace and a companionable truth. So we kept moving, not toward a destination, but toward the kind of honesty that survives long deserts and long nights, that keeps going when the road grows quiet. I can continue that exact story, but here is an original piece in a similar mood, 20 sentences. The road wore her footsteps in as a thread of dawn. She carried a map of questions rather than places, creased at every uncertain corner. Winds kept time with her breathing, counting out the hours like beads. There were towns that offered rumors and cafes that offered silence, both of them cheap. You learned to measure danger not by shadows but by how honest you could stay inside your skin. Her pockets held nothing precious except small stones that clicked with every step. At night the sky was a relay of lanterns, each star handing off a confession. She spoke to the desert as a stubborn tutor, asking questions it would not answer. The road grew quiet, and in that quiet the truth started walking ahead of her. When the rain came, It did not wash away the fear but sharpened it into clarity. She learned to listen to the silence between sounds, where a truth might crouch. A truck passed once with blinking lights like a pulse, then vanished into the horizon straight. In those long hours she kept a promise she hadn't sworn aloud, to keep going, even when the map dissolved. The honesty she pursued did not ask for applause, only endurance. Sometimes a stranger offered bread, sometimes a phrase that tasted like gravel and hope. She refused to pretend the road would tell her where she was going, only how to stay true. Dawn arrived not with bells, but with a careful tilt of the light along the windshield. She understood that honesty, like the road, was a practice of showing up again and again. If the miles wearied her, they also laid the ground for a new kind of courage, and so she kept to the pace of truth, allowing it to pull her forward long after the night had laid its head to rest. Dawn teased the horizon with pale fingers, but she did not pause. Her footsteps kept the measured cadence of conviction, unafraid of first light. The town woke behind her like a memory sliding back into a drawer. She carried the quiet rain of yesterday in her pockets, a world saved for later. Along the road, a lamppost blinked awake, as if blinking at her resolve. She asked the wind for a map, and the wind offered whispers in the dialect of storms. The river by the edge of town hummed a tune she almost recognized. She met an old man with a lantern who did not ask for her name, only her truth. He spoke of losses that refused to be buried, and she nodded, listening as trees did to rain. The lantern's glow steadied her steps, turning trimmer into track. By mid-morning, a memory she had buried rose, wearing the face of a friend asking for mercy. She did not betray it to panic. She folded it into the folds of her coat and walked on. The road widened into a shoulder where the world let her decide its pace. She learned again that truth is not a verdict but a lingering ache that clarifies the air. A dog barked once in the distance and then fell silent as if agreeing with her. Somewhere a clock registered a small victory, and she smiled at the stubborn math of time. The city that would be her witness waited beyond a curve of hills, breathing in its own weather. She rehearsed a question she had learned to fear, and replaced it with a question she could bear to ask. The answer, however, arrived not in words but in the careful settling of dust on a window pane. She stepped into the light of noon, already listening for the next true thing, not the next easy thing. The street seemed quieter than its noon glare suggested. She felt the sun tighten around her like a lid that might not lift again. The market stall hawked spices that smelled like summer storms. She moved past them, listening for the sound of a thing that would outlast a rumor. A stray cat watched from a doorstep and then followed the rhythm of her steps. The river at the edge of town breathed in sighs of heat and memory. She remembered the last time she chose something fulsome, wore the color of ash for days. The next choice, she decided, would be smaller but no less true.